Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The October wind cut through the pines differently up here, carrying that sharp mountain cold that reminds you just how far from civilization you really are. I'd driven out to test some new gear I'd picked up over the summer, a lightweight hammock system, water purification tablets, the whole setup that outdoor magazines swear will change your life. My divorce had finalized 8 months earlier, right around my 37th birthday, and I'd been pouring money into hobbies ever since. The trailhead parking area had been empty except for my Subaru and an old pickup truck with rust eating through the wheel wells. 20 miles of dirt road between me and the nearest paved highway, another 40 to the closest town worth mentioning. Perfect conditions for what I needed. Absolute solitude to figure out if I could still handle being alone with myself. I'd made good progress that first day, pushing about 15 miles into the backcountry before setting up camp near a creek bend where the water ran clear over granite stones. The spot had everything: flat ground for the tent I'd brought as backup, trees spaced right for the hammock, fresh water nearby. I spent the afternoon organizing gear, taking notes on what worked and what didn't, feeling that satisfaction of self-sufficiency settling into my bones. Around sunset, I'd hiked a quarter-mile upstream to filter water for dinner and breakfast, leaving my camp to gather firewood on the way back. The freeze-dried pad thai actually tasted decent after a day of trail mix and jerky. I remember sitting by the fire, watching sparks rise into the darkness, thinking maybe I'd finally turned a corner on the whole starting over thing. The first sign happened when I went to hang my food bag. Every backpacker knows the drill: string it up high between trees, keep the bears from getting interested. I'd picked 2 pines about 30 feet from where I'd built the fire, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints in the soft dirt around my hammock setup, pressed deep like someone had stood there for a while. Not mine. I wear size 11 Merrells with a distinctive tread pattern I'd recognize anywhere. These were smaller, maybe size 9, with a heel pattern that looked almost military. The prints circled my entire camp area, pausing at my pack, my hammock, the spot where I'd stacked my firewood. My chest tightened as I followed the trail with my headlamp. Whoever made these had been here while I was upstream getting water, walking through my space, touching my things maybe, learning my setup. But the rocks were what really got under my skin. 3 of them, each about the size of a softball, arranged in a perfect triangle near the base of the tree where I'd leaned my trekking poles. They weren't randomly scattered. Someone had deliberately placed them there, points aligned precisely north-southeast. I found another arrangement 20 yards out, this time 4 rocks in a square with a 5th one dead center. Then another past that, and another. They formed a rough perimeter around my camp, maybe 8 or 9 of these little formations total. Some kind of marking system, had to be. I stood there in the dark, headlamp beam cutting through the trees, trying to convince myself that maybe day hikers had come through. Maybe it was some geocaching thing. Maybe anything except what my gut was screaming, that someone had been watching me set up camp, cataloging my equipment, and leaving these markers for a reason I didn't understand. I pulled out my phone, hoping for even 1 bar of signal to call for advice. Maybe check if there were any warnings about the area. Nothing. The screen showed emergency calls only, and even that was questionable this deep in the mountains. The nearest cell tower was probably 60 miles away. I spent the next hour breaking down the rock formations, scattering them into the underbrush, trying to reclaim some sense of control over the situation. Packed everything valuable into my sleeping area, rigged a few empty cans on paracord as makeshift alarms around the perimeter. The kind of thing that seems clever when you're desperate but probably wouldn't stop anyone who really wanted to get close. I lay in my hammock fully clothed, boots still on, knife clipped to my belt, telling myself I was overreacting. Sleep came in fragments, never deeper than that surface level where every sound jolts you awake. A branch cracking somewhere to the east, wind through the pines that sounded too rhythmic, too much like breathing. Around what my watch said was 2 in the morning, I heard something that made me sit up completely. A barred owl call, perfect in its execution, except barred owls don't live this far west. They're an eastern species. Their range stops hundreds of miles from here. I know birds. Spent 2 summers volunteering with the Audubon Society after college. Whoever made that call knew exactly what they were doing. Probably learned it from YouTube or one of those hunting apps. They were signaling to someone or testing if I'd respond, or just letting me know they were out there. The call came again 5 minutes later, closer this time, from the north side of my camp where the trees grew thicker. I slipped out of the hammock, moving as quietly as I could manage in hiking boots on dried pine needles. The knife felt pathetically small in my hand, a 4-inch folding blade meant for cutting rope and opening packages, not for whatever this was becoming. I crouched behind a thick Douglas fir and waited, controlling my breathing, listening for movement. Then came a coyote yip from the west, high and keening, except it had that same manufactured quality as the owl call. Too precise, too practiced. They were triangulating my position using animal sounds, probably 2 of them, maybe 3. Classic hunting technique. Use calls to communicate without seeming human. Make your prey think they're surrounded by wildlife instead of people. My mouth went dry as I realized how much planning this took. These weren't random hikers who'd stumbled onto my camp. They'd probably seen my car at the trailhead, followed me all day at a distance, waited for dark. The next sound made my decision for me. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, crunching through the understory about 40 yards south. Not trying to be silent anymore, wanting me to hear them approach, I grabbed my pack, left everything else, the hammock, the tent, the cooking gear, all of it, and started moving north, away from the footsteps, deeper into the forest. No headlamp, navigating by moonlight and memory, trying to put distance between myself and whatever sick game these people were playing. Behind me, I heard my camp alarm trip, the cans rattling against each other. Then silence. Then laughter, low and appreciative, like someone admiring a child's attempt at being clever. They weren't chasing me yet. They were going through my abandoned gear, learning more about me, deciding how this would go. I moved through the forest for what must have been an hour, staying near the creek for navigation but far enough away that the water noise wouldn't mask approaching footsteps. Every 50 yards or so I'd stop, crouch, listen. Nothing at first. Then maybe 30 minutes into my escape I heard it. A whistle, long and low, somewhere behind me to the east. An answering whistle came from the west, different pitch, different person. They were flanking me, keeping pace, letting me know they knew exactly where I was. The terror of it was how patient they were. No running, no shouting, just this steady, methodical pursuit. Like they'd done this before. Like they knew exactly how long it took for fear to break someone down, make them sloppy, make them fall or panic, or do something stupid that would end this little chase. My legs were burning by the time I reached a section of deadfall. Massive trees blown down in some old storm, creating a maze of trunk and branches 15 feet high in places. I crawled into the tangle, finding a hollow beneath 2 crossed logs where I could hide and catch my breath. Pulled out my phone again. Still nothing. Battery at 60%. I turned it off to save power, then remembered the GPS function would work without signal. Turned it back on, marked my location, tried to figure out the fastest route back to the trailhead. 20 miles of wilderness. But if I pushed hard, stayed off trail, maybe I could make it by noon. That's when I saw the text message notification. 1 bar of signal, barely registering. The message was from an unknown number, received an hour ago when I must have passed through a pocket of coverage. Nice gear, the hammock especially. We'll take good care of it after you're gone. My throat closed up. They had my phone number. They'd been close enough to see the brand of my hammock maybe while I was setting it up, thinking I was alone. Another whistle. Closer now. Maybe 200 yards. They were tightening the circle. Scrambled out of the deadfall and kept moving, following the creek downstream. knowing it would eventually lead to the valley where I'd parked. The moon was setting, darkness thickening under the canopy. I stumbled over roots, scraped my palms on bark, kept going. Then I heard something that changed everything, a dog barking, that deep, purposeful bay of a hunting hound catching scent. Of course they had dogs. This was their territory, their game. They probably lived in one of those little mountain towns, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and outsiders are tolerated only as long as they keep passing through. The barking got louder, more excited. The dog had found my trail from the camp. I had maybe 10 minutes before it caught up. No way to outrun a dog in this terrain, not with 15 miles still to cover. I made the choice that probably saved my life. Instead of running, I doubled back toward my abandoned camp, moving perpendicular to my original trail, wading through the creek to break the scent line. Let them think I was still fleeing north while I circled back. I found my camp destroyed, gear scattered and torn apart, my expensive hammock shredded into ribbons and hung from branches like party streamers. But they'd left my car keys. I'd hidden them separately in a zippered pocket they must have missed. I grabbed them and a water bottle, then heard voices approaching from the north. Casual conversation like they were on a morning hike. The dog was with them, leashed now, whining with frustration at losing the trail. I belly crawled into thick undergrowth and waited, breathing through my nose, watching their headlamps sweep the clearing. 3 of them, all men, dressed in hunting camo. One had a crossbow. They stood in my destroyed camp for maybe 5 minutes, discussing whether to wait for me to circle back or keep pushing north. The older one, gray beard visible in the lamplight, finally said I was probably smarter than the last one. Might make it interesting. They left heading northwest, taking their time, confident they'd pick up my trail again soon. I waited another 20 minutes after their voices faded, then started the most careful, quiet journey of my life. Stayed off the main trail, paralleling it through the brush, stopping every 100 yards to listen. The sky was starting to lighten in the east when I heard the dog again, baying excitedly from somewhere up the mountain. They'd found where I doubled back, realized my trick. But I had a 2-hour head start now, and desperation making me fast. I half ran, half stumbled those final 8 miles, branches tearing at my clothes, pack bouncing against my spine. Reached a ridge where I could see down into the valley, and there it was, the dirt road, my Subaru still parked alone at the trailhead. No other vehicles. They must have been dropped off, planning to take their time with me, maybe drive my car out themselves when they were done. I practically fell down the last slope, key already in my hand, threw myself into the driver's seat and locked the doors. Engine turned over on the first try. I drove those 20 miles of dirt road faster than was safe, fishtailing around curves, gravel pinging off the undercarriage. Made it to the highway as full daylight broke through the trees. Drove straight through to the state police station in the nearest real town, walked in looking like hell. Clothes torn, covered in dirt and dried sweat. The officer at the desk, a young woman with kind eyes, took one look at me and got her sergeant. I told them everything, showed them the text message, the photos I'd managed to take of the boot prints before deleting them in panic. They sent 2 units up to check the trailhead, found nothing but my destroyed gear scattered in the woods. No prints except mine, no trace of the men or the dog. The message on my phone had somehow deleted itself, showing nothing in my inbox. The sergeant suggested maybe I'd had a wildlife encounter, gotten spooked, torn up my own gear in the dark. Panic does strange things to people, he said. But he took my report anyway, filed it under suspicious activity. I never went back to get my gear, wrote it off as a loss, sold my camping equipment online the next month. Started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma, though I never told her the whole truth, just said I'd had a bad experience hiking alone. 6 weeks later, I was grabbing coffee in town when I overheard 2 guys at the next table talking about some hiker who'd gone missing up in those same mountains. Different trailhead, they said, but same general area. They found his car but never found him. The search had been called off after a week. I left my coffee untouched, walked out on shaking legs, Sat in my car for an hour trying to decide if I should go back to the police. But what would I tell them that I hadn't already said? That I'd overheard a conversation about a missing person in the same area where I'd claimed to be hunted? They already thought I'd imagined it all. I drove home, looked up the missing hiker online. His name was Robert, 43, recently divorced, had just gotten into solo backpacking. The parallels made me sick. I still check the news for missing hikers in that area, still jump when I hear whistling in public, still can't shake the feeling that somewhere in those mountains, those 3 men are preparing for the next one who thinks the wilderness is empty. The flyers were everywhere that Saturday morning in early June, when I stopped for coffee at the gas station near Cedar Ridge Park. A 7-year-old girl named Mia had wandered off from her family's campsite 3 days earlier, and the whole town had mobilized to find her. I'd just turned 31 that spring, no kids of my own yet, but seeing that little face with the gap-toothed smile made my chest tight. The volunteer coordinator at the fire station barely glanced at my driver's license before handing me an orange vest and assigning me to Search Team 4. We'd be covering the northeastern section of the forest, about 2 miles from where Mia was last seen. The team leader, a retired park ranger named Carl with weathered hands and kind eyes, explained that we'd spread out in a line, staying within voice range, and work our way systematically through the undergrowth. Our group was small, just 5 people including me. There was Carl, of course, then a married couple who ran the hardware store downtown, and a college kid home for summer break who kept checking his phone until Carl told him to save the battery. The forest was denser than I expected, with thick clusters of pine and oak that blocked most of the sunlight even at noon. We'd been searching for about 4 hours, calling Mia's name until our throats were raw, when the afternoon heat really started to press down. Carl had us take a water break near an old logging road, and that's when I heard it. Faint at first, almost lost in the rustle of leaves, but unmistakable once I focused on it. A child crying, high and desperate, coming from somewhere up the ridge to our right. I grabbed Carl's arm and pointed, but he was already on his radio, trying to raise the other teams to see if anyone else was hearing what we were hearing. The crying got louder, more urgent, and I couldn't just stand there anymore. I told Carl I was going to check it out, that it was maybe 200 yards up the slope at most. He shook his head, said protocol was to stay together, never split the team, but those sobs were tearing right through me. The hardware store couple, the Andersons, they heard it too, and the woman had tears in her eyes. Carl tried the radio again, but all he got was static, and the crying kept pulling at us, raw and terrified. I started moving toward the sound before I even realized I'd made the decision. Carl called after me to wait, that he'd go with me, but his knee had been giving him trouble all day and I was already scrambling up through the underbrush. I shouted back that I'd mark my path, that I'd yell if I found anything, and then I was pushing through a wall of mountain laurel, following those heartbreaking sounds. The ridge was steeper than it looked from below, covered in loose shale that kept sliding under my boots. I had to grab onto saplings and exposed roots to keep my balance, and twice I went down hard on my knees. The crying seemed to move, first ahead of me, then slightly to the left, like the child was wandering in circles. My volunteer vest kept snagging on thorns and low branches, and I could feel sweat running down my back, soaking through my shirt. About halfway up, I lost sight of the others completely, the forest swallowing even their voices. But the crying was clearer now, and mixed in with the sobs I could hear actual words, just fragments really, please and help, and what sounded like mommy. I pushed harder, my legs burning, thinking about that little girl alone out here for 3 days, probably dehydrated, definitely terrified, maybe hurt. The top of the ridge flattened out into a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by a thick wall of evergreens. In the center, partially hidden by tall grass, was a faded blue camping tent, the kind you'd buy at any sporting goods store. The crying was coming from inside it, muffled but steady, and I practically ran toward it, calling out Mia's name. My voice cracked on the second syllable, and suddenly the crying stopped. Complete silence, not even birds or insects, just my own ragged breathing and the blood pounding in my ears. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds waiting, then called out again, softer this time, saying it was okay, that I was here to help, that her parents were looking for her. Nothing. The tent didn't move, no response at all, and a cold weight started forming in my gut even though the afternoon sun was beating down on the back of my neck. I approached the tent slowly, noting how the grass around it had been trampled down in a rough circle, like someone had been walking around and around it. The zipper was partially open, maybe 6 inches, and through the gap I could see something dark inside. I reached for the zipper, announcing myself again, saying I was with the search party, that everything would be okay. My fingers were just touching the metal pull when I heard it again, the crying, but wrong somehow. It was coming from inside the tent, but had a tinny, hollow quality to it. I yanked the zipper down and stumbled backward when I saw what was inside. A small two-way radio, the heavy-duty kind contractors use, sitting on top of a bunched-up sleeping bag. The crying was coming from its speaker, looping now that I was paying attention. The same sequence of sobs and pleas repeating every 40 seconds or so. A recording. Someone had recorded a child crying and was broadcasting it from this radio. My mind went blank for a moment, just complete static, because this didn't make any sense. Who would do this? Why would anyone set up a fake distress call during an actual search for a missing child? Then the implications hit me all at once, like ice water flooding my veins. This was bait. Someone had deliberately lured me up here, away from the group, to this isolated spot where no one could see or hear me. I spun around, scanning the tree line, and that's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh ones in the soft dirt, leading from behind the tent in a wide arc through the grass, disappearing into the trees directly behind where I was now standing. The prints came out of the forest, circled the tent several times, then headed back into the woods, but on the opposite side from where I'd approached. Whoever made them had been here recently, maybe even while I was climbing the ridge, and could very well still be watching from the shadows between the trees. I reached for my phone with numb fingers, but of course there was no signal this deep in the forest. The radio in the tent kept playing its horrible loop, and now that I knew it was fake, I could hear how the breathing patterns were too regular, how the words were spaced too evenly. I grabbed the radio, looking for an off switch, and found a folded piece of paper taped to its back. My name was written on it. Not my full name, just my first name, Jennifer, in careful block letters with black ink. Someone knew I would be the one to find this. Someone had been watching our search team, had seen me specifically, had counted on me being the one to break away from the group when I heard the crying. The paper was damp with condensation, and when I unfolded it, there was a single line written inside. You should have stayed with the others. A branch snapped somewhere behind me, not far, maybe 20 feet into the trees. I dropped the radio and it hit the ground, still playing that damned recording. Another snap, this one to my left, and I realized with perfect crystalline clarity that I was being herded. Whoever was out there wanted me to run in a specific direction, probably into another trap or toward a vehicle waiting on some old logging road. I thought about screaming for help, but Carl and the others were too far away, and it might provoke whoever was watching into acting faster. Instead, I did the only thing that made sense in that moment of pure panic and adrenaline. I ran straight back the way I'd come, crashing through the underbrush, skidding down the loose shale, not caring about the branches whipping across my face or the thorns tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I could hear pursuit, not running but walking steadily, deliberately, like they knew exactly where I was going and weren't worried about keeping up. Halfway down the ridge, my foot caught on an exposed root, and I went down hard, rolling several feet before slamming into a fallen log. Pain shot through my ribs, and for a moment I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, could only lie there gasping while listening to those steady footsteps getting closer. That's when I heard Carl's voice, faint but unmistakable, calling my name from somewhere below. I screamed then, screamed his name and help, and someone's following me, all in one hysterical burst. The footsteps behind me stopped. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my side, and half ran, half fell the rest of the way down the slope until I could see orange vests through the trees. Carl was climbing toward me with the college kid right behind him, both of them wide-eyed and breathing hard. I collapsed into Carl's arms, babbling about the tent and the radio and the note with my name on it, and he held me steady while scanning the ridge above us. But there was nothing there. No movement, no sound except that faint, tinny crying still drifting down from the tent. The police found the tent exactly where I said it would be, the radio still broadcasting its loop until the battery died around sunset. They photographed everything, bagged the radio and the note as evidence, took castings of the footprints. But there were no fingerprints on anything except mine, no DNA evidence, no trail to follow once the footprints reached the rocky ground on the far side of the clearing. They questioned everyone on the search teams, checked if anyone had been filming or taking pictures that might have caught someone watching us. Nothing. The detective, a woman with tired eyes who'd been working the case since Mia first disappeared, told me the setup had probably been there for hours before we arrived, that whoever did it had likely been gone long before I reached the tent. But I knew better. I'd heard those footsteps following me down the ridge, measured and patient, like someone who'd done this before and would do it again. She didn't argue with me, just wrote everything down and said they'd increase patrols in the area. They found Mia 2 days later, thank God, alive and relatively unharmed, hiding in a drainage pipe about a mile from her family's campsite. She'd gotten turned around in the dark and had been too scared to come out when she heard people calling. The news should have made me feel better, should have closed the chapter on that horrible Saturday, but it didn't. Because whoever set that trap, whoever wrote my name on that paper and waited in the woods, they weren't connected to Mia's disappearance at all. They were just someone who saw an opportunity in the chaos of a search, someone who wanted to separate a volunteer from the safety of the group. I changed my phone number, varied my routes to work, installed new locks and a security system. But sometimes, especially when I'm alone and hear a child crying in a grocery store or playground, my whole body goes cold and I'm back on that ridge, reading those 5 words that still wake me up at night. I never volunteered for another search. My college roommate Lisa had been trying to drag me out of the city for weeks, and when she mentioned an overnight fishing trip along the Clearwater River, I finally gave in. Her cousin Paul supposedly knew every hidden spot worth fishing up there, claimed his grandfather had shown him places where catfish grew bigger than your arm. I packed my gear that Saturday morning, stuffing my dad's old tackle box into the trunk, even though I hadn't used it since high school. 2 hours north through winding mountain roads, we met at the ranger station parking lot. Paul already there, leaning against his truck with a map spread on the hood. He kept pointing at different bends in the river, explaining how the current changed with the season, how November brought the big ones closer to shore. We had maybe 2 hours before dusk to scout the perfect spot for our overnight setup. Paul led us down the main trail from the parking area, his voice carrying through the trees as he explained water temperatures and feeding patterns. My day pack bounced against my back, loaded with water bottles, energy bars, and the headlamp Lisa insisted I bring for the scouting walk. About a mile in, the trail branched into 3 directions, and Paul stopped, studying each path like he was reading something the rest of us couldn't see. He pointed left toward what he called the deep pools, told Lisa to check the middle path that followed the river's main channel, then nodded at a narrow track cutting right through the birch trees. He pulled a whistle from his pocket, pressed it into my hand, said to give 3 sharp blasts if I found anything promising. 45 minutes, he said. Then we'd meet back here to compare notes before setting up camp at the best location. The game trail wound through tall grass and young birch trees, narrow enough that branches kept catching my sleeves. I could hear the river somewhere to my left, that constant rush of water over rocks, but couldn't see it through the thick undergrowth. After about 10 minutes of walking, the path opened into a small clearing where someone had built a fire ring from river stones, probably fishermen from earlier in the season. The ashes inside looked old, weathered by rain, and pine needles had blown across everything. I kept going, ducking under low branches, and that's when I spotted Paul's water bottle sitting perfectly upright on a flat rock beside the trail. Not tossed or dropped, but placed there deliberately, the blue Nalgene bottle he'd been drinking from during the drive-up. I picked it up, confused, wondering how he'd gotten over here when I'd watched him head the opposite direction. I called out his name, waited for a response, but only heard the river and wind moving through the trees. The bottle was empty, the cap screwed on tight, and I noticed the rock had been cleared of leaves and debris, like someone had prepared that exact spot. I tucked the bottle into my pack, figuring Paul must have scouted this trail earlier, maybe yesterday or this morning before Lisa and I arrived. But something about the placement bothered me. Too deliberate, too much like a marker or sign. The trail curved ahead, disappearing into denser forest, and I almost turned back right then, except I could see another clearing through the trees that might open onto the river. 5 more minutes, I told myself. Then I'd head back whether I found a good spot or not. The clearing turned out to be a false promise, just another cluster of birch trees, but beyond it the trail started descending toward what had to be the river. That's where I found Lisa's baseball cap, the faded Mariners one she'd worn all day, hanging from a branch at exactly eye level. The branch had been bent down and twisted to hold it in place, deliberate enough that wind couldn't have done it. My chest tightened as I lifted the cap off the branch, turned it over in my hands. A few strands of her dark hair were still caught in the adjustment strap. I knew Lisa's path had run parallel to mine, maybe a quarter mile over, but there was no connecting trail I could see, no broken branches or footprints showing how the cap had traveled between paths. The sun was dropping faster now, throwing long shadows between the trees, and I pulled out my phone to check the time. No signal, which I'd expected, but I'd been walking for 25 minutes already. I should have blown the whistle then, should have turned around and jogged back to the meeting point, but I needed to understand what was happening. Lisa wouldn't have left her favorite cap, and Paul wouldn't have abandoned his water bottle, not when we'd need them for the overnight trip. I kept walking, slower now, scanning the ground and trees for any sign of my friends, for footprints or broken branches that might explain the items. The trail opened onto a narrow beach along the river, maybe 15 feet of rocky shore before the water started. Perfect spot for fishing, actually, with a deep pool where the current slowed and eddied back on itself. But what caught my attention were the fresh footprints in the sand, 2 sets walking along the water's edge, one larger, one smaller. Paul and Lisa had to be, except the tracks led in only one direction, heading downstream toward where the beach ended in a tangle of fallen trees. I followed the footprints, my boots crunching on the wet sand and river stones. They stayed close to the water, never deviating, never showing any sign of stopping or turning around. Where the beach narrowed, forcing me closer to the tree line, I found Paul's fishing vest draped over a piece of driftwood. The vest with all his gear, his lucky lures he'd been bragging about, the knife his grandfather had given him. Every pocket was still full, zipped closed, nothing taken. I grabbed the vest, slung it over my shoulder, and that's when I noticed the 3rd set of tracks. These came from the forest, larger boots with a deep tread pattern, and they followed behind Paul and Lisa's prints at maybe 10 feet back. The spacing was strange, irregular, like whoever made them kept stopping and starting, maintaining that exact distance. My mouth went dry as I traced the tracks with my eyes, saw how they never came closer, never fell farther behind, just shadowed my friend's path with mechanical precision. The light was failing now, that gray twilight that makes everything look flat and colorless. I pulled out my headlamp but didn't turn it on yet, not wanting to announce my position to whoever had left those tracks. The whistle was still in my pocket, but blowing it seemed pointless now, maybe even dangerous. I backtracked to where the 3rd set of prints emerged from the forest, found a narrow gap between 2 fallen logs where someone had pushed through. The bark was scuffed, fresh scratches in the wood, and there were broken twigs on the ground, stepped on deliberately to avoid making noise. I crawled through the gap, following the trail backward, trying to understand where this person had come from. The tracks led uphill, away from the river, weaving between trees with purpose. Then they stopped at a small rise that overlooked the beach, the spot where someone had stood watching, waiting. There were knee prints in the dirt where they'd crouched, and cigarette butts, 5 of them, ground out carefully and lined up in a row like they were keeping count of something. I stood there in the growing darkness, trying to piece together what I was seeing. Someone had watched Paul and Lisa from this spot, tracked them along the beach, but where were they now? The footprints on the beach had ended at the fallen trees with no return tracks, no sign of where anyone had gone. I turned to head back down to the river, and that's when I heard it. A branch snapping somewhere behind me, maybe 30 yards back in the direction I'd come from. Not the random crack of wood settling or an animal moving through, but the sharp, distinct sound of weight being placed wrong, then quickly shifted. I held my breath, stayed perfectly still, and heard nothing for 10, 20, 30 seconds. Then another step, careful this time, barely audible over the sound of the river below. Someone was following my exact path, had probably been following since I'd found the water bottle, letting me collect the items they'd placed, watching me discover each piece of their setup. My mind raced through the options while my body stayed frozen. Run back to the cars, but that meant passing whoever was behind me. Continue downstream, but the tracks had led to a dead end. Hide and wait them out, but darkness was maybe 15 minutes away and they obviously knew these woods better than I did. I chose movement, stepping as quietly as possible down the slope toward the river, using trees for cover, trying to circle wide around where I'd heard the footsteps. Every few steps I'd pause, listen, and each time I stopped, the forest behind me would go silent too, like we were playing some horrible version of red light, green light. The pattern was too perfect, too controlled, and I realized this person wasn't just following, they were herding me, pushing me towards something specific. When I tried to veer left, back toward the main trail, a whistle came from that direction, 3 short blasts, the exact signal Paul had told us to use. But it wasn't Paul's whistle. The pitch was wrong, higher, and it came from the wrong direction entirely. The river was my only option now, the water loud enough to cover my movement, cold enough to break any scent trail if this person had dogs. I crashed through the last bit of undergrowth, not caring about noise anymore, and hit the beach running. My headlamp bounced in my pack as I sprinted along the rocky shore, following Paul and Lisa's tracks toward the fallen trees. Behind me, I heard whoever it was drop all pretense of stealth, heavy boots pounding down the slope I'd just descended. They were faster than me on familiar ground, and I could hear them gaining as I reached the log jam where the tracks ended. That's when I saw it. A blue tarp stretched between 2 trees just beyond the fallen logs, and underneath it, Paul and Lisa, sitting on the ground with their backs against a large boulder. They weren't moving, weren't responding to my shouts, and as I scrambled over the logs toward them, I saw why. Their hands were zip-tied behind their backs, duct tape across their mouths, and their eyes were wide with terror, looking not at me, but past me, at whoever was now climbing over the logs behind me. I grabbed the knife from Paul's vest, sliced through Lisa's zip ties first while she made frantic sounds through the tape. The footsteps behind me had stopped, and when I glanced back, I saw a man standing on top of the log pile, maybe 15 feet away. He was older, maybe 50, wearing hunting camo and a backpack, holding a camera with a long lens. Not pointing it at us, just holding it, watching. Lisa ripped the tape off her mouth, gasped something about him taking pictures of them all afternoon, following them from spot to spot, getting closer each time. I cut Paul free while keeping my eyes on the man, who still hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, just stood there like he was waiting for something. Paul grabbed his vest from me, pulled out a canister of bear spray he kept in the inner pocket, and that's when the man finally moved, not toward us but backward, disappearing over the logs into the growing darkness. We didn't wait to see if he'd come back, just ran upstream along the beach, scrambling over rocks and through shallow water until we found a deer trail that led back up toward the main path. The 3 of us made it back to the parking lot in under 20 minutes, running most of the way with our headlamps cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Paul's truck was still there, my car next to it, but there was a third vehicle now, an old van with mud-covered plates parked at the far end. We didn't stop to investigate, just threw our gear in the trucks and peeled out of there, Paul leading the way with Lisa in his passenger seat while I followed close behind. We drove straight to the ranger station, but it was closed, dark, nobody around. The nearest police station was 40 minutes away in town, and by the time we got there and explained everything to the officer on duty, it was past 9 at night. They sent 2 units back to the trailhead with us, but the van was gone, no sign of anyone in the woods. The police took our statements, said they'd increase patrols in the area, but without a clear photo of the man or a license plate number, there wasn't much they could do. Lisa remembered seeing him earlier that day at the ranger station, pretending to study the trail maps while they were getting their fishing permits, and Paul said he'd noticed someone matching that description at the gas station where we'd stopped for supplies. We never went back to fish the Clearwater River, never even talked about trying again somewhere else. Lisa moved in with her sister in Portland a few months later, said she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched even in the city. Paul still goes fishing, but only in groups now, never alone, never in remote spots. The police called me once, about 6 weeks after that night, said they'd found an abandoned campsite deeper in the woods with dozens of photos tacked to trees, all of different people on trails, at beaches, setting up camp. None of us were in those photos, which somehow made it worse knowing we weren't the first, probably wouldn't be the last. I still think about that man sometimes, standing on those logs in the darkness, how he moved backward into the forest like he belonged there, like we were the intruders in his territory. I think about those 5 cigarette butts lined up in a row, and I wonder what he was counting, what signal he was waiting for, what would have happened if I'd arrived 5 minutes later, or not at all. Most folks around here inherit their first rifle the same way they inherit their grandfather's watch, passed down when you're old enough to understand its weight. Mine came wrapped in an old wool blanket on my 14th birthday, along with Dad's promise to take me out to the Carter's property once deer season rolled around. By the time I turned 23, we'd made that trip to Virginia every November like clockwork. Just the 2 of us camping in that same clearing near the creek where Dad said he'd taken his first buck 40 years prior. That particular Saturday started out perfect, crisp autumn air, and not a cloud in sight. The kind of day where you can smell winter creeping in through the dried leaves. We'd driven down from Roanoke in Dad's pickup, the bed loaded with our gear and enough provisions for 3 days, though we both knew we'd probably head back Sunday night regardless of what we bagged. Setting up camp went like it always did, each of us falling into our roles without needing to speak much about it. Dad handled the fire pit while I strung up our food supplies between 2 oaks, high enough that the black bears wouldn't get interested. The Carters owned about 300 acres of prime hunting land, mostly dense forest, with a few natural clearings where the deer liked to graze at dawn and dusk. They lived up in Washington now, some government job that kept them busy year-round, but they let a handful of locals use the land during hunting season, as long as we kept to ourselves and didn't leave a mess. We'd seen their nephew once, maybe twice over the years, checking on the old cabin near the eastern boundary, but otherwise the place stayed empty from September through January. Dad always said that's what made it perfect, just wilderness and silence, no other hunters stumbling through your spot or scaring off the game. We spent the afternoon scouting, walking the trails we knew by heart, and checking for fresh signs. Found plenty of tracks near the water, droppings that couldn't have been more than a day old, and rubs on the saplings where the bucks had been marking their territory. Dad pointed out a scrape beneath a low-hanging pine branch, the earth torn up and musky with scent, said we should set up near there come evening. His knees weren't what they used to be, I could tell by the way he favored his right leg going uphill, though he'd never admit it out loud. We decided he'd take the stand we'd built 3 seasons back, about 15 feet up in a sturdy hickory with clear sightlines to the creek, while I'd position myself on the ground near a cluster of white pines about 70 yards east. The plan was simple enough. Wait for the golden hour when they'd come down to drink, take a clean shot if we got one, track it if necessary. By 5:30 we were in position, the forest settling into that peculiar quiet that comes before dusk. I had my rifle resting across my lap, safety on, breathing slow and steady the way Dad taught me, becoming part of the landscape. The temperature dropped fast once the sun started sinking behind the ridge, maybe 45 degrees, cold enough that my breath came out in little puffs that I tried to aim away from my scope. Every small sound seemed amplified in that stillness. A squirrel rustling through the leaves 20 yards away might as well have been an elephant. A woodpecker's distant hammering echoed like gunfire. Then I heard it. The snap of a branch followed by another, deliberate and heavy, coming from the north. Through the gaps in the pine needles I caught movement, a flash of brown against the darkening forest. Then the full shape emerged into the small clearing ahead of me. 8-point buck, massive, probably 200 pounds if he was an ounce, walking with that careful grace they have when they're not quite sure about something. He stopped at the edge of the clearing, nostrils flaring, testing the wind, one ear swiveling toward where Dad sat in his stand. I clicked off the safety, trying to control the adrenaline surge that always came at moments like this, my finger hovering just outside the trigger guard. The buck took 3 more steps forward, turning broadside to me, the perfect shot presenting itself like a gift. I squeezed the trigger on an exhale, the rifle kicking back against my shoulder, the crack of the shot shattering the evening quiet. The buck jumped straight up, that telltale mule kick that meant I'd hit the vitals, then bolted into the trees heading southeast. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush, the sound growing fainter. Then nothing. Dad's whistle came from the stand, 2 short bursts that meant good shot. Wait 30 minutes before tracking. Those 30 minutes crawled by slower than any I could remember, sitting there in the growing darkness with my heart still racing. Dad climbed down from his stand and made his way over, clapping me on the shoulder, that proud smile visible even in the dim light. We went through the ritual of marking where I'd taken the shot, finding the first drops of blood on the leaves, bright red and frothy, which meant lung shot, a good clean kill. The blood trail was easy to follow at first, splattered on the dried ferns and oak leaves, leading us deeper into the woods along what seemed like an old game trail. Dad stayed behind me with the flashlight while I tracked, both of us moving quiet out of habit more than necessity. About 80 yards in, the trail opened into another small clearing, and I could make out the shape of the buck lying on its side near a fallen log. I remember feeling that mix of elation and respect you get when you take a life for food, already thinking about how we'd dress it and pack out the meat. But when I got within 10 feet of where the buck should have been, I stopped so sudden that Dad nearly walked into me. The deer was there, but it had been moved, dragged maybe 6 or 7 feet from where the blood trail ended, leaving these deep furrows in the dirt like something had grabbed it by the neck and pulled. The belly had been opened up, not with any tool I recognized the work of, but torn apart, the edges ragged like they'd been pulled rather than cut. Steam was still rising from the cavity in the cold air, which meant this had happened minutes ago, maybe while we were walking up. The intestines were gone, along with the liver and heart, but not scattered around like a coyote or bear would leave them. Just gone, taken. Dad's flashlight beam swept across the carcass, and I saw his face go rigid, that expression he got when something wasn't adding up right. Neither of us said anything for a moment, just stood there listening to the forest, which had gone completely silent, not even the usual insect noise you'd expect after dark. Dad grabbed my arm, not hard but firm enough to get my attention, and nodded toward the way we'd come. We started backing up, keeping our eyes on the trees around us, when I heard it, clear as if someone was standing right beside me, a voice that whispered, "That's mine," in this flat, wrong tone that made every hair on my neck stand straight up. The voice came from somewhere behind the fallen log, maybe 15 feet away, but when Dad swung his flashlight that direction, there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. We both had our rifles up now, safeties off, trying to cover different angles while moving backward toward the trail. Then we heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling around us just outside the flashlight's reach, branches breaking with no attempt at stealth. Dad pulled out his phone. No signal, of course, we were too deep in the woods, but the screen light gave us a little more visibility. That's when I saw them, two eyes reflecting the light about 30 yards out, too high up to be a deer, too far apart to be anything that should have been in those woods. The circling stopped, and for maybe 10 seconds, everything went quiet again, except for our breathing. Dad whispered for me to stay close. We were going to move fast back to camp, forget the deer. Forget everything except getting out of there. We'd made it maybe 20 steps when something crashed through the underbrush to our left, big enough to shake the ground under our boots, and that voice came again. Closer this time, saying, "Mine, mine, mine," over and over in this monotone chant that didn't sound entirely human. Dad fired a warning shot into the air, the sound explosive in the darkness, and whatever was out there went silent. We ran then. I'm not ashamed to admit it. Two grown men with rifles sprinting through the dark forest, like kids running from a nightmare. Branches tore at our clothes. I nearly went down twice, tripping over roots, but we kept moving, Dad's flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of us. Behind us, I could hear pursuit, not running but moving fast through the trees, keeping pace without seeming to exert effort. We burst into our campsite and Dad immediately went for the truck, throwing our rifles in the bed while I grabbed the essential gear, leaving everything else behind. The engine turned over on the third try, headlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate the trail out. As Dad threw it in reverse to turn around, something walked into the edge of the headlight beam, just for a second before stepping back into the shadows. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, walking upright but wrong somehow in its proportions. Arms too long, shoulders too narrow, and its face, God. Its face was almost human but stretched out, like someone had grabbed a normal face and pulled it forward. The mouth opened too wide, and even over the engine I heard it say "mine" one more time before Dad gunned it down the trail. We didn't stop driving until we hit the main road, didn't talk about what we'd seen until we were sitting in a well-lit diner 2 towns over, trying to make sense of something that didn't fit into any explanation we could accept. Dad called the Carters the next morning, told them we'd had to leave suddenly due to a family emergency, apologized for leaving some gear behind. They said they'd have their nephew check on it when he went down next month, make sure everything was all right. We never went back to get our stuff, never went back to hunt those woods again, and Dad sold his rifle the following spring, said he'd lost his taste for it. I kept mine but haven't used it since, just sits in the safe like some kind of reminder. We looked into the history of that land afterward, spent weeks going through old newspaper archives and county records, trying to find something that might explain what we encountered. Found a few missing persons cases from the 50s and 60s, hunters mostly, but nothing conclusive, nothing that gave us the answers we wanted. The only thing we discovered that made my skin prickle was an old property survey from 1892 that mentioned the eastern section of what became the Carter property was avoided by locals, something about it being claimed ground, though it didn't elaborate on what that meant. These days, Dad and I don't talk about that night unless we've had a few drinks. And even then we dance around the details, like saying it out loud might invite it back somehow. Sometimes I drive past the road that leads to the Carter property, always in daylight, never slowing down, and I wonder if it's still out there in those woods, waiting for the next hunter to take something it considers its own. I've thought about warning people, maybe posting something online about staying away from that area, but what would I say that wouldn't sound completely insane? That something in those woods claimed my deer and showed us its face? That it walked upright and spoke but wasn't human? No one would believe it. Hell, sometimes I barely believe it myself, except Dad was there too, saw the same thing, and that's the only reason I know I didn't lose my mind that night in Virginia. Picture 4 grown adults crammed into a break room that smells like burnt coffee and microwaved fish, avoiding eye contact while HR drones on about, fostering team cohesion after recent challenges. That was us 2 weeks ago, getting lectured because someone had filed a complaint about our department's toxic atmosphere, which, honestly, was putting it mildly, considering what had gone down between us over the past few months. Gregory from accounting suggested the hiking trip, said it would be good for us to get away from the office, from the fluorescent lights and passive-aggressive emails, and actually talk things through like normal human beings. I should have known better when he mentioned he'd found this perfect trail online. Not too challenging, but remote enough that we'd have to rely on each other. His exact words, and I remember thinking that sounded more like a threat than a team-building exercise. Saturday morning came too fast, and there we were at the trailhead parking lot. Me, Gregory, Monica from procurement, and Jason, who just transferred from the Seattle branch 3 months ago and had the misfortune of landing right in the middle of our dysfunction. Monica kept checking her phone obsessively, even though we all knew there'd be no signal once we started climbing. Jason was doing this fake cheerful thing where he commented on literally everything like some kind of nature documentary narrator, and Gregory had this massive military-style backpack like we were summiting Everest, instead of doing a 2-day loop through state forest land. The official trail started nice enough, wide and well-marked with those yellow blazes every 50 feet or so, and for about 2 hours we actually managed to maintain something resembling normal conversation, talking about anything except the investigation, the screenshots, the meeting where Monica had completely lost it and threw her coffee mug at the wall, narrowly missing Jason's head. Around noon, just when my feet were starting to complain and Jason had finally shut up about the native flora, Gregory stopped abruptly at what barely qualified as a fork in the trail. To the left, the yellow blazes continued, clearly marking the official path that curved gently upward. But to the right was this narrow deer track, or maybe an old logging road, barely visible through the undergrowth, disappearing into much denser forest. Gregory pulled out his phone, squinting at some hiking app he'd downloaded, claiming this unmarked path would cut 3 miles off our route and get us to the campsite with plenty of daylight to spare. Monica immediately started arguing that we should stick to the marked trail, her voice getting that sharp edge I recognized from budget meetings, while Jason tried to play peacemaker, suggesting we take a vote like this was some kind of democracy instead of a potential disaster waiting to happen. The thing about Gregory is, he has this way of making you feel stupid for disagreeing with him, like he's already thought through every possible objection and you're just too slow to catch up. He kept showing us his phone screen with the GPS overlay, insisting the shortcut connected back to the main trail in about 4 miles, that locals probably used it all the time, that we were being paranoid for no reason. Monica was the first to cave, probably because she didn't want to look weak in front of everyone, and once she agreed, Jason immediately fell in line, leaving me as the sole voice of reason that nobody wanted to hear. We stood there for maybe 10 minutes, the forest getting quieter around us like even the birds knew we were about to make a terrible decision, and finally I said fine, whatever. But if we got lost, it was on Gregory's head, which in retrospect was probably the stupidest thing I could have said given everything that happened next. The unmarked path started out deceptively easy, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, with occasional ribbons tied to branches that Gregory insisted were trail markers left by other hikers. But after about an hour, those ribbons disappeared completely, and the path kept splitting into smaller tracks that all looked identical, forcing us to rely entirely on Gregory's phone GPS, which he checked obsessively every few minutes, the battery icon in the corner showing a steadily declining percentage that nobody wanted to mention. The forest here was different too, older somehow, with these massive oak trees whose branches formed a canopy so thick that even in the middle of the afternoon it felt like twilight, and the undergrowth was this tangle of thorns and poison ivy that grabbed at our clothes and left angry red scratches on any exposed skin. By 3 in the afternoon, we'd been walking for 5 hours total, and Monica was starting to panic in that controlled way she had, where her voice stayed level, but her eyes darted around like a trapped animal. She kept asking Gregory if he was sure we were going the right way, and he kept saying yes, absolutely. Just another mile or so, but I could tell from the way he gripped his phone that he wasn't sure of anything anymore. Jason had gone completely quiet, which was somehow worse than his constant chatter. And every time we stopped to check the GPS or argue about which barely visible path to take, I noticed how the forest sounds would stop too. No birds, no insects, just this oppressive silence that made our voices sound too loud, too human, too out of place in whatever part of the wilderness we'd stumbled into. The real argument started around 5, when Gregory's phone finally died, and we had to admit we were completely, utterly lost. Monica went from controlled panic to full-blown fury, screaming at Gregory that this was exactly like him, always thinking he knew better than everyone else. Just like with the Morrison account that he'd tanked because he wouldn't listen to anyone's input. Gregory shot back that at least he hadn't been stealing clients like she had, which made Jason nervously interject that we should focus on finding our way out instead of rehashing office drama. But that just redirected Monica's rage toward him, asking what he'd know about anything since he'd only been there 3 months and had already managed to sleep with half the support staff. The accusations flew back and forth, each more vicious than the last. Our professional facades completely shattered as we stood there in the growing darkness, and that's when I noticed it. Just at the edge of my vision, a flash of blue fabric moving between the trees about 30 yards away, there 1 second and gone the next. I tried to point it out, but they were too busy tearing into each other to listen. Monica now accusing Gregory of deliberately getting us lost as some kind of power play. Gregory calling her paranoid and unstable. Jason trying to physically get between them as their shouting match escalated into something that looked like it might turn physical. The blue fabric appeared again, closer this time, maybe 20 yards away, and I could make out that it was someone in a jacket, just standing there behind a thick pine tree, watching us. When I finally managed to shout loud enough to get their attention and pointed to where the person had been standing, there was nothing there, just empty forest, and they all looked at me like I was losing it, the stress finally getting to me. But I knew what I'd seen, and the way the hair on my neck was standing up told me we weren't alone out here, that someone had been following us, maybe since we'd left the marked trail, maybe longer. We decided to make camp right there. Not because it was a good spot, but because it was getting dark and nobody could agree on which direction to try next. The clearing was barely big enough for our tents, surrounded by these twisted birch trees that looked like bones in the fading light, and we set up in angry silence, each person as far from the others as the small space would allow. Monica had brought one of those emergency whistles and kept blowing it every few minutes. 3 sharp blasts that echoed through the forest until Gregory told her to stop because she was giving him a headache, which started another argument about whose fault this was, who had the right to be angry, who should have known better. I kept watching the tree line while setting up my tent, looking for any sign of movement, that blue jacket, anything, but the forest had gone completely dark beyond our small circle of flashlight beams, and all I could see were shadows that might have been anything or nothing at all. Dinner was these dehydrated meal packets that tasted like cardboard soaked in salt water, eaten in hostile silence, broken only by the sound of Jason obsessively checking his dead phone like it might magically spring back to life. Around 9, Monica announced she was going to bed, zipping herself into her tent with enough force to nearly break the zipper, and Jason followed soon after, mumbling something about trying to get some rest so we could think clearly in the morning. That left me and Gregory sitting across from each other at the small camp stove, its blue flame the only light besides our dying flashlights, and he finally dropped his know-it-all act and admitted he had no idea where we were, that the GPS had been glitching even before the phone died, showing our location jumping around impossibly, sometimes putting us miles away from where we'd been seconds before. He said he'd noticed something else too, these old campsites along the unmarked trail, fire rings that looked recent but somehow wrong, like someone had been camping out here regularly, watching the trails, waiting for people stupid enough to wander off the marked paths. I barely slept that night, every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves sending adrenaline shooting through my system, and when I did drift off, I had these vivid dreams about being watched through the thin tent walls, shadows moving just outside, circling our camp like predators. When dawn finally broke, gray and misty. I crawled out to find Monica already up, standing at the edge of our clearing with her back to me, completely still. And when I called her name, she turned around with this blank expression and said, Jason's tent was empty, his sleeping bag still inside, but his backpack gone. We searched the immediate area, calling his name until our voices went hoarse. But there was no sign of him, no footprints leading away from camp, nothing except this sick feeling in my gut that whoever had been watching us yesterday had come back during the night, and Jason, always trying to avoid conflict, had probably gone with them willingly rather than wake us up and cause another scene. Gregory insisted Jason had just gone to find help on his own, too fed up with our bickering to wait for us to agree on a direction. But Monica found Jason's phone half buried in pine needles about 10 feet from his tent, and when she managed to get it powered on with her portable charger, there was a voice recording from 3:47 a.m. The audio was mostly static and wind, but underneath you could hear footsteps circling the camp, slow and deliberate, stopping occasionally right outside one of our tents. And then Jason's voice, barely a whisper, saying, "Hey, wait, what are you doing?" before the recording cut off. We played it 3 more times, each replay making it clearer that those footsteps had been there for at least 20 minutes before Jason noticed them, that whoever it was had been studying us, choosing, and the worst part was recognizing a sound in the background I hadn't noticed while sleeping. This low humming, almost like someone trying to remember a tune, getting closer and closer to Jason's tent until the recording ended. After the recording, we didn't need to discuss it. We just started packing, throwing everything into our bags with shaking fingers while constantly checking behind us, the forest suddenly feeling like it had eyes everywhere. Monica kept Jason's phone, said we'd need it for evidence when we got out, if we got out, and nobody argued with the way her voice cracked on that last part. We picked a direction, any direction that seemed to lead downhill, and started walking fast, almost running, crashing through the underbrush without caring about the trail anymore, just needing to get away from that clearing, from whatever had taken Jason, from the feeling that we were being herded like cattle towards some predetermined end. Gregory was in the lead, using a broken branch to clear the path, when he suddenly stopped and pointed at something carved into a tree trunk, fresh cuts in the bark that looked maybe a day old, just 4 words that made my entire body go cold. "You chose this path." We found the marked trail 2 hours later, those beautiful yellow blazes appearing like salvation through the trees, and we practically ran the rest of the way back to the parking lot, not stopping even when Monica twisted her ankle on a root, just supporting her between us and pushing forward. The lot was empty except for our cars and one other vehicle I didn't remember from yesterday, an old green pickup with mud-caked plates, and we didn't stick around to investigate, just threw our gear in the trunks and got out of there. We called the police from the first gas station we found, reported Jason missing, gave them the GPS coordinates from Gregory's app history, played them the recording from Jason's phone, but when search and rescue went in the next day, they said they couldn't find our campsite. No sign anyone had been there at all, like the forest had swallowed up any trace of what happened. They kept searching for 3 weeks before calling it off, said Jason probably got disoriented and wandered off, maybe fell into a ravine. But Monica and Gregory and I know better. We know someone was out there with us, watching, waiting, taking, and the worst part is that we led Jason right to them, delivered him gift-wrapped because we were too proud to admit Gregory's shortcut was a mistake. I quit my job the day after they called off the search. Couldn't stand being in that office knowing Jason's desk would stay empty, and I heard Monica and Gregory left soon after, the whole department basically imploding, which I guess was what HR wanted all along, just not like this, never like this. Montana in early May feels like the world just woke up from a long sleep, and that particular Saturday morning, I'd driven out to fish a section of the Bitterroot that most folks don't bother with anymore. Been fishing these waters since my college roommate introduced me to fly fishing back when we were both studying at Missoula, which makes it about 15 years now, give or take. The spot sits about 40 miles from any real town, down a dirt road that turns into barely a trail, then becomes nothing but deer paths through the pines. You have to want it bad enough to bushwhack the last quarter mile carrying all your gear, sliding down loose shale and pushing through serviceberry bushes that leave scratches on your waders. But the rainbow trout in that stretch of river make every scraped knuckle and thorn prick worth it, especially in spring when the snowmelt brings them out hungry and careless. By noon, I'd already landed 3 decent rainbows and lost what felt like a monster brown trout that snapped my tippet clean off near a submerged log. The sun was hitting that perfect angle where you can see straight through the water to the riverbed, all those smooth stones shifting between green and gold in the current. I was working my way upstream, casting into a deep pool where the main channel cuts hard against a granite cliff, when movement in my peripheral vision made me glance across to the opposite bank. Someone was standing in the shadows between 2 massive Douglas firs, maybe 60 feet away from me. Just standing there, not moving, not fishing, not doing anything that made sense for a person to be doing in the middle of nowhere on a Saturday afternoon. At first I figured it had to be another angler scouting the water, maybe waiting for me to move on so he could fish the pool. We fishermen can be territorial about good spots. And I get it, especially when you've hiked that far in. I raised my hand in a friendly wave, the universal river greeting between anglers, but the guy didn't wave back, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just stood there, arms hanging loose at his sides, and that's when I noticed something was wrong with his clothes. They weren't clothes exactly, more like rags or maybe just a really old shirt and pants that had been through hell, all torn up and hanging weird on his frame. The color was all wrong too, this brownish gray that matched the mud along the riverbank, like he'd been rolling in it or living in it. I turned back to my fishing, telling myself to mind my own business, but every few casts I'd steal a glance across the river. The man never moved, not once, just kept watching from between those trees with his face half hidden in shadow. After about 10 minutes of this, I hooked into another rainbow, a real fighter that took line and jumped twice before I could work it into the shallows. The whole time I'm playing this fish, concentrating on keeping the right tension, working it away from a tangle of roots, I can feel eyes on me. When I finally got the trout in my net and looked up, the man had moved closer to the water's edge, maybe 30 feet away now, and that's when I saw he was barefoot. Not just barefoot, but his feet were caked in thick mud up past his ankles, and his toenails were long and yellowed, curling over the ends of his toes like they hadn't been cut in months or maybe years. The smart thing would have been to pack up and leave right then, but I'd driven 3 hours and hiked another 40 minutes to fish this spot, and some mud-covered weirdo wasn't going to run me off. Besides, the river was between us, running fast and cold with snowmelt, at least waist-deep in most places and deeper in the main channel. I released the rainbow and moved upstream to the next good run, where the water spreads out over a gravel bar before collecting into another deep pool. Cast after cast, I tried to focus on my technique, on reading the water, on anything except the fact that this guy was following me along the opposite bank, matching my pace perfectly. He moved through the thick underbrush without making a sound I could hear over the river, never stumbling, never pushing branches aside, just gliding between the trees like smoke. By the time I hooked my 6th fish of the day, a fat cutthroat that hit my dry fly right at the tail of a riffle, the man had positioned himself directly across from me again. The river was narrower here, maybe 40 feet wide, and I could see his face clearly for the first time. His hair was dark and matted down flat against his skull, streaked with what looked like algae or riverweed. His eyes were pale blue, almost white, and they tracked every movement I made as I brought the fish in. But it was his expression that made my chest tighten, completely blank, no emotion at all, like watching a mannequin that could walk. When I bent down to unhook the cutthroat, keeping it in the water while I worked the barbless hook free, I heard something that made me stop cold. A splash, not big, just the sound of something entering the water on the other side of the river. I looked up and the man was knee-deep in the current, walking straight toward me through the rushing water like it was nothing. The river that had me bracing against every step when I'd waded in, that would knock most people off their feet in the deeper sections, didn't seem to affect him at all. He moved forward steady and smooth, his eyes locked on mine, never blinking, never looking away even when the current pushed debris into his path. My cutthroat thrashed free and disappeared, while I stood there like an idiot, holding my rod in one hand and an empty net in the other, watching this muddy stranger wade through water that should have been sweeping him downstream. The closer he got, the more wrong everything about him looked. His skin had this grayish tint under all the dirt, and there were dark stains around his mouth and under his fingernails that could have been blood, or could have been something else. 20 feet away, 15, 10, and now I could smell him over the clean scent of the river. This thick, rotten odor like meat left in the sun, mixed with pond scum and human waste. I started backing up, slipping on the wet rocks, trying to keep distance between us while my mind screamed at me to run. But he kept coming, pushed through the deepest part of the channel where the water reached his chest, and his mouth opened for the first time, not to speak but just hanging open like he'd forgotten how to close it. Inside, his teeth were brown and broken, some missing entirely, and his tongue was swollen and dark purple. When he was maybe 8 feet away, close enough that I could see bits of leaves and pine needles tangled in his beard, close enough that the smell made me gag, he stopped. Just stopped dead in the middle of the river and stared at me with those empty, pale eyes. We stood there for what felt like hours but was probably 30 seconds, him swaying slightly in the current with his mouth hanging open, me gripping my fly rod like it was some kind of weapon. Then his head tilted to one side, a slow, mechanical movement, and he raised one arm to point at my fishing vest. Not at me, specifically at the vest where I kept my caught fish in the inner pocket, the ones I was planning to take home for dinner. His finger stayed extended, shaking slightly, and then he made this sound, not quite a word, more like a wet gurgle from deep in his throat. He took another step forward, and I stumbled backwards so fast I fell, landing hard on my ass in the shallow water, cold river flooding into my waders. Scrambling to get up, I saw him bend down and pick something up from the riverbed. A dead trout that must have washed down from upstream. Probably been dead for days by the look of it. He brought the fish to his mouth and bit into it, scales, guts and all, tearing off chunks with those broken teeth while never taking his eyes off me. River water and fish blood ran down his chin, mixing with the mud and whatever else was caked on his face, and he chewed with his mouth open, making these horrible wet sounds. That broke whatever spell had been keeping me there. I turned and ran, or tried to run in waders filled with water, more like a desperate waddle toward the bank. Behind me I heard splashing, heavy and fast, and I knew he was coming after me. I made it to shore and crashed through the serviceberry bushes, branches tearing at my vest and hat, not caring about the trail or my rod or anything except getting away from whatever that thing wearing a human shape was. The quarter-mile back to my truck felt like 10 miles. I kept hearing things behind me, breaking branches, heavy footsteps, but every time I looked back there was nothing there, just empty forest. My waders were so full of water, they pulled at every step, and I ended up cutting them off with my pocket knife halfway up the slope, leaving $800 worth of Sims gear hanging from a pine branch. When I finally saw my truck through the trees, I almost cried from relief. I fumbled for my keys with numb fingers, dropped them twice before managing to unlock the door, and jumped inside. In the rearview mirror, just as I started the engine, I saw him standing at the edge of the tree line, perfectly still again, watching. He had something in his hand, another dead fish, or maybe the same one. Hard to tell from that distance. I drove out of there doing 40 on a road meant for maybe 15 miles per hour, bottoming out the truck twice and probably destroying my alignment. Didn't stop until I hit the gas station at the highway junction, where the kid working the counter took one look at me, soaking wet, covered in scratches, missing my waders, and asked if I needed him to call someone. I said no, bought a coffee with shaking hands, and sat in my truck for an hour trying to make sense of what had happened. Later, I did some asking around at the fly shop in town, careful not to sound too crazy, just mentioning I'd seen someone strange out by the river. The owner got quiet and said there'd been reports over the years, usually from solo fishermen, about a man living wild in those woods. Said he might have been someone who went missing from the state hospital 20 years back, or could be a veteran who never came home right from one of the wars, or maybe just some person who decided civilization wasn't for them anymore. Nobody knew for sure, and nobody wanted to find out bad enough to go looking. I never went back to that stretch of river, and I fish with a buddy now always. The trout aren't worth it, no matter how big they are or how hungry they're biting. The route I took that night was one I had never planned to use. My dispatcher had called in late, asking if I could deliver a load of industrial supplies to a small town near the Tennessee border. It was supposed to be a straight shot down the interstate, but a wreck ahead shut down the main highway. I pulled over at a gas station, talked to an old man who pointed out a shortcut through the Kentucky hills, narrow, twisting back roads with barely enough shoulder for a rig my size. It was late, past midnight, and the air had that thick, heavy stillness you get before dawn. I figured the quiet might help me make good time. The road wound deeper into the hills, past patches of forest that looked endless under the truck's high beams. I had the radio on low, some AM talk show fading in and out, when I saw movement near the ditch line ahead. My first thought was a deer, but then I noticed the shape. Small, human, kneeling. A woman, or at least I thought it was. Her hair hung forward, long and tangled, and she seemed to be crouched right at the edge where the forest met the road. I slowed down, leaned forward over the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it through the windshield. When my headlights washed fully over her, I realized she wasn't moving, just frozen there, hands on the ground like she was searching for something. Instinct kicked in. I eased the truck onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The silence outside hit me hard. Only the low buzz of insects and the faint rustle of trees in the dark. I opened the door and called out, asking if she was hurt, if she needed help. No answer. She turned her head slowly, and for the briefest second, I caught her face. Pale, streaked with dirt, eyes wide and glassy like she didn't recognize where she was. Before I could take another step, she bolted. No scream, no sound of branches breaking, just the motion of her body vanishing between the trees. I shouted again, louder this time, but the forest swallowed the sound whole. I stood there for a while, scanning the tree line, my flashlight cutting through the dark. It was like she had dissolved into the woods. I thought about calling the sheriff's office right there, but I convinced myself she was probably scared or maybe high and didn't want to be found. I got back in the truck and drove off, uneasy but trying to shake it off as just another strange thing you see on the road. About an hour later, I stopped at a diner near a small crossroads town, just to clear my head. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, how she had turned without a word and vanished. The waitress noticed I looked uneasy, asked if I was okay. I told her what I'd seen, half expecting her to laugh it off, but she didn't. She said people around those hills talked about missing hikers, about folks who wandered off the road and were never found. Her tone wasn't dramatic, just quiet, like she'd heard it too many times before. That made me more unsettled than anything else. By the time I reached my drop-off, dawn had started breaking over the hills. The light was soft and hazy, and for a moment everything felt normal again. I parked, handed over the papers, and tried not to mention the woman. I figured maybe I'd just misread the whole thing. Maybe she was fine. But sleep didn't come easy later that morning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face turning toward me, the way she seemed lost and hollow, as if she didn't belong in that place or that moment. When I woke up, I checked my phone. There was a local news alert about police activity along a county road not far from where I'd stopped the night before. The photo showed a stretch of road bordered by thick woods, the same spot. Curiosity got the better of me, and I drove back out there before heading home. 2 patrol cars and a white van were parked along the shoulder. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze, tied between the trees. I didn't want to get in the way, but one of the deputies noticed me slowing down and waved me through cautiously. Later that evening, I read the article online. It said that early that morning, a jogger had reported what looked like drag marks leading from the ditch into the woods. Police had found a torn piece of fabric, red and frayed, caught on a branch nearby. They hadn't identified anyone or confirmed what had happened, but the picture that came with the story, the ditch, the tree line, the angle of the road, was exactly where I had seen her. That realization hit harder than I expected, and for a long time I just sat there staring at the screen, wondering if I should have done more, if maybe she was still out there when I drove away. I went back to work the next week, trying to focus on driving and not on what I might have witnessed. But every time I took a night route through rural areas, I caught myself scanning the edges of the road, half expecting to see someone there again. About a month later, I got assigned a run through the same county. I told myself it was just another job, that the odds of anything strange happening twice in the same place were slim. Still, as I got closer to those hills, my grip on the wheel tightened. The GPS voice echoed through the cab, and when it told me to turn onto that same narrow road, I almost ignored it. The forest looked different in daylight, calmer, ordinary. Birds cutting through the branches, wildflowers growing by the ditch. But the moment I passed the spot where I had stopped before, that calm broke. There were tire marks in the gravel, not fresh but clear enough to notice. And further down, a small wooden cross stood at the edge of the ditch. No name, no flowers, just a weathered cross with a strip of red cloth tied around it. The same shade I'd seen in the photo from the news article. I pulled over, stepped out, and walked closer. For a while I just stood there, not sure what I was feeling. Guilt, fear, or something in between. That night I parked my rig behind a rest stop a few miles from town. Couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m, a sound woke me. Something faint brushing against the trailer door. It wasn't wind. It came again, soft but deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down, scanning around the truck. The forest on both sides was still as glass. But then, near the edge of the trees, I caught movement. A figure, slight, crouched, turned away the instant the beam of light hit her. The shape, the hair, the way she moved. It was her. The same woman. I shouted out, but the sound barely carried before she slipped into the trees again, just like before. I didn't report it that time. I sat in my cab till sunrise, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. When daylight finally broke, I checked the ground by the trailer. Small footprints pressed into the dirt, leading back toward the forest. That was the last route I ever ran through that part of Kentucky. Sometimes I still take the interstate nearby, and when I do, I avoid looking toward those hills. But every now and then, if I drive through after dark, I swear I catch a glimpse of someone standing by the trees. Still, quiet, watching, and I never stop anymore. The forest roads around my town are quiet after dark, the kind of quiet that makes every small sound stand out. That night, I rode my motorcycle through one of those narrow dirt paths, headlight cutting through the fog, my breath fogging up the inside of my helmet. My friend Ethan had called me a couple of hours earlier. His dog, a black shepherd mix named Jasper, had bolted into the woods chasing a deer and never came back. He lived a few miles outside town, in one of those old houses surrounded by trees so dense they almost swallowed the light. I told him I'd meet him halfway, thinking we'd just find the dog tangled somewhere or scared under a tree. The air felt heavy that night, colder than usual for early autumn. Every few minutes I passed patches of mist that hung close to the ground, and the beam of my headlight caught flashes of something white. Just fog, I told myself. I kept the engine at a low hum, not wanting to scare Jasper if he was nearby. My phone was mounted on the handlebar, the GPS marking the trail that led toward Ethan's place. Around me, only the rhythmic growl of the bike and the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires filled the silence. About 20 minutes in, I slowed down near a bend where the trees pressed close on both sides. There was a faint sound, like a branch cracking somewhere behind me. I figured maybe it was just a deer, but it came again, sharper this time from the same spot. I stopped the bike, turned off the engine, and let the darkness close in around me. The silence after the engine died was so complete it almost rang in my ears. I took off my helmet and listened. For a few seconds, nothing. Then came the sound again, slow, deliberate steps through dry leaves, moving just beyond the edge of the headlight's reach. I called out Jasper's name, my voice sounding too loud in the still air. No response. I shone my phone flashlight toward the trees, and the light caught on something pale between the branches. Maybe bark, maybe not. Whatever it was, it shifted when I moved the light. I waited, heart thudding in my chest until the silence returned. That was enough for me. I started the bike again and gunned it down the trail toward Ethan's place, refusing to glance back even once. By the time I reached Ethan's driveway, the trees had thinned, and I could finally see the outline of his porch light through the haze. He came out before I even parked, flashlight in hand, his face tense. He said he'd heard barking earlier near the creek behind the house, but it stopped all at once. We decided to split up. He'd search the yard while I checked the tree line where the property ended. The woods looked different there, denser somehow, as if the trunks were standing closer than they should. My flashlight beam moved across them, catching bits of fog that twisted and disappeared in the light. A noise came from deeper inside, the same sharp crack of wood I'd heard before. I froze in place, listening again. This time, it wasn't just one sound. It was several, like something moving slowly, pushing through the brush, careful but massive. I called Ethan's name, but he didn't answer. My instinct screamed at me to move, but curiosity held me there just long enough to hear something breathe. Not panting like a dog, but long, uneven exhales that broke through the silence like someone forcing air through their throat. That's when I saw movement, tall, hunched, shifting just enough for my light to catch the edge of what looked like a shoulder. I backed away, nearly tripping over a root before running back toward the house. When I reached the porch, Ethan was standing there, still scanning the woods. I told him we should get inside, but he was sure it was just a deer. We argued quietly until Jasper's collar jingled somewhere in the dark, followed by a short bark that didn't sound right. Too low, almost strained. Ethan's expression changed. He went down the steps, calling for his dog. I followed with the flashlight, though part of me didn't want to. We walked maybe 30 feet before the barking stopped again. Then everything went silent, except for the wind passing through the trees. We waited there for what felt like forever before heading back to the porch. Ethan locked the door behind us, still insisting it had to be an animal. We sat there for a while, both of us trying to listen for Jasper. I left shortly after, uneasy but pretending to be calm for his sake. The next day he called and said Jasper hadn't come back. He sounded different on the phone, quieter, like he hadn't slept. A few hours later, he sent me a message saying he'd checked his security camera, and there was something he wanted me to see. When I got to his house that evening, he had the footage paused on the living room TV. The camera was angled toward the porch, catching the faint glow from the single bulb above the steps. For a few seconds, it showed nothing but shadows and the edge of the woods in the background. Then something moved, slowly stepping into the light. It was tall enough that the top of its head almost touched the frame of the porch roof. Its shape was wrong, too thin, too long in the arms, as if it had been stretched. It paused under the light, and the moment the brightness touched it, the image flickered like static. When the screen cleared, it was gone. Ethan rewound it 3 times, his hands trembling slightly every time the thing appeared. There was no clear face, just a pale blur where one should be, and the way it stood. It looked aware of the camera, like it had stepped forward on purpose. The strangest part was the sound that followed. The microphone caught faint breathing, but not from the porch. It came from behind the camera inside the house. The recording ended abruptly when the porch light went out. I remember Ethan staring at the screen, his mouth slightly open, whispering that the light bulb had burnt out that same night. We went outside to check the porch anyway, even though every part of me wanted to leave. The bulb was intact, just unscrewed halfway, hanging loose in its socket. The woods beyond the yard were completely dark. No sound, no crickets, no wind. Just that thick, unnatural stillness again. We didn't say much after that. I helped him screw the light back in, and when it flicked on, I could swear I saw something pale shift between the trees before disappearing into the dark again. A week later, Ethan moved out. He never told anyone where he went. The house is still there, but people in town say the light on the porch sometimes turns on by itself, even though no one's lived there for months. I have not gone back down that road since that night, but sometimes when I ride through the countryside after dark, I catch myself glancing at the tree line. Every time I do, I feel like something out there is already watching,